The vampire king stared at the crayon-decorated cast the little girl held toward him, reading the message scrawled in purple marker. His expression darkened as courtiers whispered nervously. But when she innocently repeated what the rogue vampire had told her, the king's fury would reshape vampire law forever, starting with hunting down the monster who dared use his authority to terrorize children. The massive oak doors of the throne room groaned open as evening court reached its peak, ancient hinges protesting against centuries of wait, while torchlight flickered across stone walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of human empires. Emma Chen stepped through the entrance with the determined stride of someone who had never learned to fear monsters, her small sneakers squeaking against polished marble as she clutched a purple cast decorated with crayon drawings that seemed to glow under the dim lighting. The cast bore the artistic efforts of a child's imagination, unicorns prancing across plaster, rainbows arcing in impossible colors, and stick figures holding hands beneath a smiling sun that no vampire in this room had seen in centuries. King Alaric Nightborn sat motionless on his obsidian throne, carved from a single block of volcanic glass that reflected the torchlight like captured starfire. His pale fingers gripping armrests worn smooth by millennia of rule, while his dark eyes tracked the small intruder with the intensity of a predator, suddenly presented with something entirely outside his experience. The Vampire King had ruled for over 2,000 years, had seen the fall of Rome and the rise of steel cities, had negotiated treaties with werewolf packs and fey courts, had survived assassination attempts from his own kind and rebellions that shook the foundations of supernatural society, but never in all those centuries had a human child simply walked into his throne room during active court proceedings as if she belonged there. His guards, elite vampires who could move faster than human eyes could track, and whose reflexes had been honed by centuries of combat, stood frozen in confusion as this small figure in a bright yellow dress marched past them with the confidence of visiting royalty, apparently oblivious to the fact that she was surrounded by creatures who could tear her apart without breaking concentration on their evening meal plans. Emma approached the throne with the same fearless determination she might use to ask her teacher for help with homework, reaching into a small backpack covered in cartoon characters to produce a purple marker that she held out toward the Vampire King like an offering to an ancient god. The marker was the cheap kind sold in school supply stores, its plastic cap chewed by nervous teeth and its tip slightly dried from being left uncapped too long, but she presented it with the gravity of a diplomat offering a peace treaty. Alaric leaned forward slightly, his movement causing the shadows around his throne to shift and dance while his courtiers pressed closer to witness this unprecedented breach of protocol, their whispered conversations dying into absolute silence as they realized their king was actually considering the child's unspoken request. The Vampire King's voice, when he finally spoke, carried the weight of centuries and the carefully controlled power of something that had learned to mask its true nature behind civilized speech. He asked what she wanted him to sign, his tone gentle despite the predatory stillness that surrounded him like a second skin. And Emma's response came with the bright enthusiasm of a child who had discovered something wonderful and wanted to share it with everyone. She explained that she wanted him to sign her cast like the other vampire did, turning her arm so he could see the message scrawled across the purple plaster in handwriting that was too careful, too practiced, too deliberately childish to be genuine. The words made Alaric's expression shift from curiosity to something far more dangerous as he read the purple marker inscription that claimed responsibility for breaking a child's arm with a cheerful apology and a single-letter signature. His hands, which had remained steady through centuries of warfare and political intrigue, began to tremble with barely contained rage as he processed the implications of what he was seeing, while Emma continued her explanation with the innocent enthusiasm of someone sharing good news. She told him about the really nice vampire man with yellow eyes who had saved her from getting hit by a car, describing how he had healed her scraped knee with just a touch of his fingers, before deliberately breaking her arm and explaining that he worked for the Vampire King and was practicing for some new laws that required hurting children in specific ways. The throne room fell silent, with the kind of absolute quiet that precedes either violence or revelation, every vampire present understanding that their king's fury was building toward something that would reshape their world, while the human child continued chattering about her encounter with genuine fondness for someone who had deliberately caused her pain. Emma described how the vampire had been dressed in an expensive suit that reminded her of the fancy clothes her father wore to important business meetings, how his fangs had been just like the ones she could see when Alaric spoke, and how he had known so many interesting things about vampire rules and customs that she thought he must be very important in vampire society. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her backpack and showed it to Alaric, revealing a child's drawing of the encounter that captured details no human should have been able to observe. The precise length of vampire fangs, the exact color pattern of eyes that changed during feeding, the way shadows seemed to bend around vampire forms even in daylight. The Vampire King studied the drawing while his courtiers exchanged worried glances, each of them recognizing that someone with intimate knowledge of their society was using that knowledge to target human children while claiming to act under royal authority. Alaric's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the vast throne room as he asked Emma to describe exactly what the vampire had told her about these new laws. And her response sent ice through the veins of every immortal creature present, as she recited phrases that could only have come from someone who had attended the king's private council meetings, where modernization of vampire-human relations had been discussed in strictest confidence. The child explained that the nice vampire man had told her that the king was planning to change the old rules so that vampires could practice their skills on human children, instead of having to hunt dangerous adults, and that breaking her arm was just a gentle way to help her get used to being around vampires, so she wouldn't be scared when the new laws went into effect. Emma's innocent retelling of this conversation revealed a level of inside knowledge that made Alaric realize he was dealing not with a random rogue vampire, but with someone from his own inner circle, someone who had access to classified discussions and was now using that access to systematically undermine everything he had worked to build. The Vampire King's rage began to manifest in ways that made the air around his throne shimmer with barely contained power, while ancient magic responded to his emotional state by causing the obsidian throne to emit a low humming sound that resonated through the stone floor and into the bones of everyone present. Emma, oblivious to the supernatural tension building around her, continued, explaining how the vampire had suggested she visit the king to get his autograph too, describing the encounter as if it had been a delightful adventure rather than a calculated attack designed to destroy the carefully maintained balance between two species that had spent centuries learning to coexist without warfare. Marcus stepped forward from his position beside the throne, his hand instinctively moving toward the silver blade at his hip, before he remembered that the threat they faced was not something that could be solved with conventional weapons, his weathered face reflecting the same controlled fury that burned in his king's eyes as he processed the implications of what they had just learned. The captain of guards had served Alaric for over 5 centuries, had fought beside him in the Shadow Wars, and helped negotiate the Great Covenant that ended vampire-human hostilities. And in all that time, he had never seen his king struggle so visibly to contain the kind of rage that could level city blocks if allowed to manifest fully. Alaric rose from his throne with the fluid grace that marked him as something far older and more dangerous than his human appearance suggested, his movement causing every vampire in the room to instinctively step back, while Emma remained perfectly at ease, apparently viewing his approach as a sign that he was ready to sign her cast. The Vampire King knelt beside the human child, bringing himself down to her eye level with the careful control of someone who could accidentally crush bones with an absent gesture. His voice gentle despite the fury radiating from him like heat from a forge, as he asked if she remembered anything else about her encounter with the other vampire. Emma's face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who had found an interested audience for her story, and she began describing details that made every supernatural being present understand that they were dealing with a threat unlike anything they had faced in centuries. She explained how the vampire had known her name before she introduced herself, how he had described specific members of the king's court with accuracy that suggested recent contact, and how he had mentioned plans for something he called the return that would make vampires the rulers of both day and night. The child's innocent recounting of these details revealed a conspiracy that reached into the heart of vampire government while demonstrating a level of planning and preparation that spoke to years of careful observation and infiltration. Alaric listened to every word while his mind raced through the implications of what he was hearing, calculating threats and responses with the strategic thinking that had kept his people hidden and safe for over a millennium, while simultaneously grappling with the personal violation of having his own authority used to terrorize an innocent child. The Vampire King realized that dismissing court and beginning an immediate investigation was no longer just a matter of justice, but a question of survival for the delicate balance that kept supernatural society from collapsing into the kind of open warfare that would destroy both species. Emma yawned and rubbed her eyes with the back of her uninjured hand, the excitement of meeting a real king finally giving way to the exhaustion that came with staying up past bedtime. And Alaric found himself making a decision that surprised even his oldest advisors as he gently lifted the child into his arms and called for his personal staff to prepare guest quarters in the most secure section of the palace. The Vampire King carried Emma through corridors lined with tapestries that depicted the secret history of supernatural civilization, past portraits of previous rulers whose painted eyes seemed to follow their progress through halls that echoed with the whispers of courtiers trying to process what they had just witnessed. Marcus followed close behind, his hand now resting openly on his weapon as he scanned every shadow and alcove for potential threats while mentally cataloging the security measures that would need to be implemented to protect both the child and the secrets she had inadvertently stumbled into. The whole guest quarters Alaric selected were normally reserved for visiting vampire nobility, furnished with antiques that predated most human civilizations and protected by ward spells that could repel everything from physical attacks to mental intrusion. But tonight, they would shelter a human child whose simple request for an autograph had exposed a conspiracy that threatened to unravel centuries of careful diplomacy. Emma was asleep before her head touched the silk pillow, exhaustion finally claiming her as she clutched a teddy bear that one of the palace servants had quietly placed beside her, the stuffed animal's button eyes reflecting the soft glow of enchanted lights that would keep watch over her throughout the night. Alaric stood in the doorway for several minutes, studying the peaceful face of the child who had unknowingly delivered intelligence that could prevent a war, his ancient mind already working through the investigation that would have to begin immediately if they had any hope of stopping whatever plan was already in motion. He turned away from the sleeping child and walked to the nearest window, pressing his palm against glass that was older than most human cities, while he stared out at the lights of the metropolis below and contemplated the weight of decisions that could either preserve the peace he had spent centuries building or watch it crumble under the ambitions of someone who had betrayed everything vampire society claimed to represent. The city lights twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing human lives that hung in the balance. While somewhere in those same streets, a rogue vampire with access to royal secrets planned the next phase of a campaign designed to return their kind to the brutal old ways that Alaric had worked so hard to leave behind. The Vampire King stepped from his limousine onto the cracked asphalt of Maple Street, his polished shoes clicking against scattered glass from broken streetlights that would never be repaired in this forgotten corner of the city. The scent of fear still lingered here, 3 days old, but sharp as copper pennies against his enhanced senses, mixing with the everyday odors of exhaust fumes and overflowing dumpsters that marked human poverty. Marcus flanked him, hand resting on the concealed weapon beneath his jacket, while two other investigators melted into the shadows to canvass the area with supernatural efficiency that would leave no trace for human authorities to stumble upon. Alaric paused at the intersection where Emma had been struck, crouching to examine the pavement where her blood had pooled, now scrubbed clean by well-meaning paramedics who had unknowingly destroyed evidence that might have led him directly to his quarry. The Vampire King closed his eyes, drawing the lingering essence of violence into his lungs, tasting the metallic signature of another vampire's presence like bitter wine on his tongue. But the scent was wrong, familiar yet distorted, as if someone had deliberately masked their true nature beneath layers of expensive cologne and human pretense. He straightened, brushing dust from his charcoal suit, and turned toward the towering glass monument of Mercy General Hospital that dominated the skyline like a beacon of human resilience against the darkness that surrounded them all. Dr. Sarah Martinez looked up from her computer screen as the tall stranger approached the nurse's station, his movements too fluid and graceful for any ordinary human, carrying himself with the kind of quiet authority that made even veteran hospital staff step aside without thinking. She had been expecting someone like him, though she couldn't have explained why, ever since that strange little girl had been brought in with injuries that defied medical explanation and a story that sounded like something from a fantasy novel. The man introduced himself as Alaric Nightborn, claiming to be a specialist in unusual trauma cases, but his pale skin and the way he avoided looking directly at the fluorescent lights overhead triggered every instinct she had developed during 15 years of emergency medicine. When he asked about Emma Chen, his voice carried a weight of genuine concern that surprised her. Not the detached professional interest she had expected from yet another consultant trying to make sense of the case that had been keeping her awake for 3 nights running. She found herself studying his face as he spoke, noting the aristocratic features that belonged in a museum portrait, rather than a modern hospital. The way his dark eyes seemed to hold centuries of sadness, despite appearing no older than 35, and the unconscious elegance with which he handled the cheap plastic chair as if it were made of the finest materials. Against her better judgment, she led him to the secure wing where Emma was recovering, her small form dwarfed by the hospital bed, but her spirit undimmed as she chattered animatedly to a stuffed elephant that some kind stranger had left at her bedside. Emma's face lit up when she saw Alaric, though she had never met him before, something in his presence calling to the part of her that had been touched by supernatural forces in that dark alley 3 nights ago. She held up a crayon drawing she had been working on, a crude but surprisingly detailed sketch of a man in a black coat with yellow eyes and sharp teeth, standing next to what appeared to be a fancy car that gleamed like obsidian in the streetlight. The Vampire King felt his dead heart clench as he recognized elements that no human child should have been able to observe or remember, details that spoke of someone with intimate knowledge of vampire society and the resources to maintain the kind of luxurious lifestyle that marked the ancient nobility of his kind. Emma babbled happily about the nice vampire man who had talked to her while they waited for the ambulance, explaining how he had known all sorts of interesting things about vampire kings and their courts, and the special rules that govern their behavior toward humans in the modern world. Dr. Martinez watched Alaric's face grow pale as marble as the child innocently repeated phrases and concepts that could only have come from someone with access to the most secret protocols of vampire governance, information that was restricted to perhaps a dozen individuals in the entire supernatural community. When Emma mentioned that the vampire had seemed sad about having to hurt her, but said it was necessary for some important changes that were coming to their world, Alaric's hands began to tremble with barely suppressed rage at the realization that someone was using a child as a weapon in whatever political game they were playing. The security footage from the hospital's external cameras showed exactly what Alaric had feared he would find: a tall figure in expensive clothing, moving with the inhuman grace that marked his kind. but the face remained frustratingly obscured by shadow and careful positioning that spoke of someone familiar with surveillance systems and how to avoid them. Marcus appeared at his shoulder as they reviewed the digital files in the hospital's security office, his expression grim as he reported the results of his own investigation into the surrounding area. 3 witnesses had seen a black luxury sedan in the vicinity around the time of Emma's accident, but their descriptions varied wildly in ways that suggested supernatural influence on their memories, leaving only fragments of truth scattered among carefully implanted false recollections. The attending paramedic remembered treating injuries that seemed to heal themselves even as he worked, while the police officer who had taken Emma's initial statement found his notes mysteriously altered when he tried to review them the next day. Key details replaced with mundane explanations that satisfied his superiors but left him with nagging doubts about what had really happened. Dr. Martinez joined them as they finished reviewing the footage, her professional skepticism warring with the growing certainty that she had stumbled into something far beyond her understanding, though her protective instincts toward Emma kept her from simply walking away, as wisdom dictated she should. The pattern that emerged over the following hours painted a picture that chilled Alaric to his ancient bones, reports filtering in from Marcus and the other investigators that revealed a methodical campaign of terror targeting the most vulnerable members of human society. In Portland, a 6-year-old boy named Timothy had been approached by a vampire claiming to work for the king, his arm deliberately broken in 3 places before being healed just enough to avoid permanent damage. The psychological trauma carefully calibrated to create maximum fear while avoiding the kind of serious injury that might trigger a full investigation by human authorities. The vampire had made sure to mention King Alaric by name, describing the court hierarchy in enough detail to convince the child that this was official vampire business, even going so far as to explain certain ancient laws that governed supernatural interaction with humans as if justifying his actions. In Seattle, twin sisters had been subjected to similar treatment, their legs broken and partially healed, while their attacker spoke at length about the old ways and how the current vampire king was too soft in his dealings with the human world, planting seeds of terror that would grow into lifelong trauma, while simultaneously undermining Alaric's authority among both his own people and any humans who might eventually learn of their existence. Each incident showed an escalation in violence and psychological manipulation, suggesting that whoever was behind these attacks was building towards something far more devastating than simple random cruelty. Dr. Martinez found herself drawn deeper into the investigation, despite every rational instinct screaming at her to maintain professional distance, her medical training proving invaluable as she analyzed the injuries with an expert eye that could detect subtleties hidden from even supernatural senses. The precision of the bone fractures spoke of someone with extensive anatomical knowledge, each break calculated to cause maximum pain, while avoiding the major blood vessels and nerve clusters that could result in permanent disability or death. But more disturbing were the healing patterns she discovered in the X-rays and blood work, evidence of supernatural intervention that had been carefully modulated to leave the children functional, but forever marked by their encounter with forces beyond human understanding. The vampire responsible had clearly studied human physiology extensively, understanding exactly how much trauma a child's body could endure while still maintaining the fiction that these were accidents rather than deliberate torture, a level of medical knowledge that suggested either centuries of experience or access to modern scientific resources that most vampires lacked. When she shared her findings with Alaric, she watched his aristocratic features harden into a mask of cold fury that made her understand why his kind had once been the apex predators of the human world, despite his obvious efforts to become something gentler and more civilized in the modern era. Lady Vivian Ashford arrived at the hospital as the sun set over the city, her elegant form gliding through the corridors with the kind of supernatural grace that made humans step aside without understanding why. her presence immediately recognizable to Alaric as one of the few vampires he trusted completely with matters of state. She had served on his council for over 2 centuries, her political acumen and ruthless intelligence making her invaluable in navigating the complex web of supernatural politics that governed their hidden world. But her expression tonight carried a weight of concern that sent ice through his veins. The attacks were not random, she reported in low tones that would not carry to human ears, but part of a coordinated campaign that had been building for months beneath the notice of even their most skilled intelligence networks. Each incident had been carefully timed to coincide with Alaric's public announcements about modernizing vampire law, creating a direct correlation between his progressive policies and increased violence against human children that could be used to undermine his authority among the more traditional members of vampire society. Someone with intimate knowledge of court politics and timing was orchestrating these attacks, she concluded. Someone who understood that the most effective way to destroy a king was not through direct confrontation, but by making him appear weak and ineffective in protecting those under his theoretical protection. The timeline that emerged as they pieced together intelligence from across the region revealed a pattern that made Alaric's blood run cold with recognition. Each attack occurring within 48 hours of his announcements about treaty negotiations with human governments or new protocols for vampire behavior in the modern world. The perpetrator was not simply trying to terrorize children, but was using their suffering as a weapon against everything Alaric had worked to build over the past century, knowing that any exposure of vampire existence through these attacks would destroy the careful balance that kept both species safe from the kind of war that would devastate human civilization while potentially exterminating vampires entirely. Dr. Martinez listened to their analysis with growing horror, finally understanding that Emma's broken arm was not an isolated incident, but part of something vast and terrible that threatened everything she had believed about the safety of the world around her. As midnight approached and Emma slept peacefully in her hospital bed, surrounded by guards both human and supernatural, who would die before allowing further harm to come to her, Alaric stared out at the city lights and realized that the enemy he faced was not some random rogue vampire, but someone from within his own inner circle, someone who knew his plans and policies well enough to time their attacks for maximum political damage while demonstrating the kind of detailed knowledge about vampire society that could only come from years of close proximity to the highest levels of power in his court. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The words hit Alaric like shards of ice piercing ancient stone. Emma sat cross-legged on the palace guest bed, absently scratching at the edge of her cast while recounting her encounter with childlike precision that made every detail burn deeper into his memory. The old king's way of doing things. Those exact words hadn't been spoken in his presence for 50 years. Not since the night he'd stripped his nephew Victor of succession rights and banished him from the court. The vampire king's hand stilled on the windowsill as Emma continued chattering about how the nice vampire man had told her that breaking arms was practice for the new rules, that the old king would have done much worse, that children needed to learn their place in the coming order. Each innocent repetition of Victor's poison sent cold fury racing through Alaric's veins like mercury in winter air. Victor Drakel, his sister's son, the golden heir who had charmed courts across 3 continents before revealing his true nature in a blood-soaked rampage through a human settlement. The young vampire who had laughed as he explained that humans were cattle, that mercy was weakness, that the old ways of terror and domination were the only path to true power. Alaric had spent decades trying to forget the sound of Victor's voice as guards dragged him away, his promise that the soft-hearted king would rue the day he chose human sympathy over vampire strength. Now that voice echoed in Emma's innocent recounting, each word a poisoned arrow aimed at everything Alaric had built in 50 years of careful peace. The Vampire King turned from the window to study Emma's face, noting the subtle changes that had begun manifesting since her hospital visit. Her hearing had sharpened enough to detect conversations 3 rooms away. Her scrapes from playground falls healed within hours instead of days, and twice he had caught her eyes reflecting light in the darkness like faceted gems. Victor hadn't simply assaulted a random child. He had chosen her deliberately, begun a transformation that would either kill her or turn her into something unprecedented, a bridge between species that could be weaponized in ways that made Alaric's ancient blood run cold. Dr. Sarah Martinez arrived at the palace within the hour, her medical bag clutched tight as guards escorted her through corridors that seemed to absorb light and whisper secrets in languages older than written history. She had agreed to examine Emma after Alaric's carefully worded phone call, though her professional skepticism warred with genuine concern for her young patient and growing curiosity about the mysterious man who had taken such intense interest in the case. The Vampire King met her at the entrance to Emma's chambers, his pale features composed, but eyes holding depths of worry that seemed far too profound for someone she had known only days. Dr. Martinez conducted her examination with methodical precision, drawing blood samples and testing reflexes while Emma chattered about her new home and the fascinating people she had met. The results, processed in the palace's surprisingly modern medical facility, made Dr. Martinez's hands shake as she stared at readings that defied everything she understood about human physiology. Emma's blood showed cellular regeneration rates that belonged in science fiction. Her nervous system displayed hyperactivity consistent with neurological enhancement, and her bone density had increased by 15% since her hospital admission 3 days prior. When Dr. Martinez confronted Alaric with the impossible data, demanding explanations for changes that violated basic biological laws, the Vampire King made a decision that would bind their fates together in ways neither could anticipate. He led her to his private study, poured 2 glasses of wine that sparkled with an otherworldly sheen, and began to speak truths that unraveled her understanding of reality. Vampires were real, had lived hidden among humans for millennia, governed by ancient laws that protected both species from mutual destruction. He was their king, had ruled for 8 centuries, dedicated his reign to maintaining the delicate balance that kept supernatural creatures in the shadows and human civilizations safely ignorant of predators that walked among them. Emma had encountered Victor, a rogue vampire whose attack was not random violence but the opening move in a campaign designed to shatter the peace Alaric had spent centuries building. Dr. Martinez listened with the part of her mind that cataloged symptoms and analyzed data, forcing herself to process impossible information with clinical detachment, even as her worldview collapsed and reformed around truths that made Emma's medical anomalies suddenly, terrifyingly clear. The revelation session was interrupted by Marcus bursting into the study, with news that drained color from Alaric's already pale features and sent ice through Dr. Martinez's newly educated understanding of their situation. Victor had been confirmed in the city through blood-tracking magic performed by Elias, the court's ancient mage, whose scrying had traced supernatural signatures to 12 locations across the metropolitan area. More disturbing, the tracking revealed that Victor was not working alone. At least 3 other vampires moved with him, suggesting a coordinated effort rather than lone vengeance. Emma's transformation showed signs of careful planning and precise execution that indicated medical knowledge and supernatural expertise far beyond what a single rogue vampire could possess. The realization that Victor had spent 50 years in exile gathering allies and resources, studying human anatomy and vampire biology to develop new methods of forced transformation, painted a picture of methodical preparation that made Alaric's stomach clench with dread. Dr. Martinez found herself thrust into a planning session where discussions of ancient magic and supernatural politics mingled with medical assessments and treatment protocols in ways that challenged her sanity while demanding her expertise. Emma's condition was deteriorating despite outward appearances of improvement. Her enhanced abilities were burning through her human nervous system like acid through delicate tissue, creating changes that would either complete her transformation into something unprecedented or kill her within days. The Vampire King and the Human Doctor formed an unlikely alliance born of necessity, her scientific knowledge complementing his supernatural understanding as they worked to develop treatments for a condition that existed at the intersection of species, beyond the scope of either medicine or magic alone. Elias arrived as sunset painted the palace walls in shades of blood and shadow, his ancient features grave with news that sent new waves of alarm through their desperate consultation. The court mage had detected disturbances in the supernatural fabric of the city, signatures of power being channeled in patterns that suggested ritual preparation on a massive scale. Victor was not simply hiding, he was building something, gathering energy and resources for an event that would require immense magical investment and careful timing. The tracking spells revealed movement between locations that included hospitals, schools, and youth centers, a pattern that made Emma's targeting seem less random and more like the first step in a systematic campaign against children. Dr. Martinez found herself providing medical insights about human development and physiology, while Elias explained vampire transformation mechanics and the ways supernatural energy could be manipulated to force changes in human subjects. The collaboration revealed disturbing possibilities. Victor appeared to be developing a method for rapid, controlled transformation of multiple subjects simultaneously, creating an army of vampire children who would be powerful, loyal, and psychologically malleable in ways that adult converts never could be. Emma's partial transformation was a test case, her body serving as a laboratory for techniques that could be applied to dozens or hundreds of other children if Victor's plan proceeded unchecked. The Vampire King listened to their analysis with growing horror, recognizing the strategic brilliance of an attack that would not only destroy his peaceful coexistence with humanity, but create a new generation of vampires raised from childhood to see humans as prey and violence as natural law. As midnight approached and Emma's condition continued to fluctuate between human and supernatural, Alaric made the decision to involve Dr. Martinez fully in their world, binding her with ancient oaths of secrecy while granting her access to resources and knowledge that might save not only Emma but prevent a catastrophe that would reshape the relationship between species forever. The plan they developed was desperate and dangerous, requiring Dr. Martinez to work with vampire biology she barely understood, while Alaric used powers that risked exposing his true nature to human authorities. Emma's treatment demanded a combination of human medicine and supernatural healing that had never been attempted, techniques that could either reverse her transformation or accelerate it beyond control. Time pressed against them like a physical weight, as Elias's scrying revealed Victor's activities intensifying, magical energies building towards some climactic event that would likely coincide with Emma's transformation reaching its crisis point. The Vampire King found himself trusting a human doctor with secrets that could destroy his people, while Dr. Martinez committed herself to saving a child, using methods that challenged everything she had sworn to uphold as a physician. Their alliance was sealed not by formal oaths, but by shared determination to protect Emma and prevent Victor from using her suffering as a weapon against innocence. As the night deepened and supernatural forces gathered in the darkness beyond the palace walls, Alaric and Dr. Martinez worked with desperate precision to save a little girl whose courage had accidentally awakened ancient evils and whose survival might determine the future of two species, locked in a balance more fragile than either had ever imagined. The abandoned cathedral loomed against the storm clouds like a monument to forgotten faiths, its Gothic spires piercing the darkness, while gargoyles leered down from crumbling buttresses that had weathered centuries of wind and neglect. Alaric approached the massive oak doors with supernatural silence, every sense extended to catalog the dangers that waited within walls that had once witnessed the first vampire laws being carved into stone by creatures who believed themselves gods among mortals. The scent of fear hung thick in the air, young terror mixing with the metallic tang of spilled blood, and something else that made his ancient instincts recoil with recognition and dread. Victor's presence saturated the holy ground like poison seeping through sacred stone, his nephew's signature twisted by decades of exile into something that barely registered as the same species. The Vampire King's hands trembled with barely restrained fury as he detected the unmistakable scent of children's tears, innocent suffering that Victor was using as both weapon and message in his campaign to drag their kind back into the darkness from which Alaric had spent centuries trying to emerge. Marcus had wanted to bring a full strike team. Lady Vivian had advocated for calling in ancient allies who owed blood debts to the crown, but Alaric knew that Victor would kill his hostages the moment he sensed overwhelming force approaching. This confrontation had to be personal, king to exile, uncle to nephew, the old way against the new in a battle that would determine whether vampires could continue evolving toward something better or would be dragged back into the predatory nightmare that had once made them legends of terror, whispered around human fires. The cathedral doors swung open at his touch, revealing a nave transformed into a chamber of deliberate horror that showcased Victor's decades of planning and preparation. Two children hung suspended from the ancient chandelier by chains that had been carefully positioned to avoid lethal damage while maximizing psychological trauma, their small forms swaying slightly in the drafts that whistled through broken stained glass windows. The boys were brothers, Alaric realized with sick certainty, their family resemblance clear even through the terror that had aged their young faces beyond their 6 and 10 years. Victor emerged from the shadows behind the altar like a specter of vengeful nobility, his once golden hair now white as bone, his aristocratic features sharpened by hunger and madness into something that belonged more in nightmare than memory. The exile had grown gaunt during his years away from the court, his expensive clothing hanging loose on a frame that spoke of feeding only when necessary, surviving on scraps and fury while he planned his return to power. Yet his eyes burned with the same intelligence that had once made him the heir apparent, the keen political mind that had grasped court intrigue and supernatural law with an ease that had made Alaric proud before it had been turned to purposes that made his blood run cold. Victor smiled as he recognized his uncle, an expression of such genuine warmth and affection that it made the surrounding horror even more chilling, as if the decades of exile had been merely an extended vacation rather than banishment for crimes that still haunted Alaric's dreams. The explosive charges became visible as Alaric's eyes adjusted to the cathedral's gloom, shaped charges positioned with military precision at structural weak points that would bring the entire building down in a controlled collapse if triggered. Victor had learned new skills during his exile, modern techniques to supplement ancient powers, turning the sacred space into a trap that would kill everyone inside if Alaric used his full vampire strength against the building's support columns. The Vampire King forced himself to remain calm as Victor began his explanation, voice carrying the same cultured tones that had once charmed diplomatic missions and smoothed treaty negotiations before being corrupted by philosophies that reduced humans to livestock and vampires to their predators. The plan was elegant in its vicious simplicity: systematically torture children while claiming to represent the Vampire King, document the attacks through carefully leaked information to human authorities, eventually forcing a war between species that would shatter Alaric's peaceful coexistence and return vampires to their proper role as apex predators, ruling through fear rather than hiding in shadows. Victor gestured to the suspended children with proprietorial pride, explaining how each carefully calibrated injury had been designed to create maximum trauma while avoiding the kind of permanent damage that might interfere with their eventual transformation into loyal soldiers in his new vampire army. The exile had studied human psychology and child development during his years away, learning how to break young minds and rebuild them according to his vision of vampire superiority. He spoke of Emma with particular enthusiasm, describing her partial transformation as proof of concept for techniques that could create an entire generation of vampire children raised from infancy to see humans as prey and violence as natural law. Emma's arrival shattered the careful choreography of Victor's monologue, her small form slipping through shadows with supernatural grace that made both vampires turn toward the cathedral's side entrance. She had followed despite explicit orders to remain safe at the palace, her enhanced senses allowing her to track scents that even trained vampire guards had missed in their sweep of the area. The partial transformation that Victor had begun was accelerating under stress, her human limitations burning away to reveal abilities that existed at the intersection of species in ways that had never been recorded in vampire history. She moved with predatory fluidity that would have been impossible for a normal child, her eyes reflecting ambient light as she catalogued threats and opportunities with tactical awareness that belonged to a seasoned warrior rather than a 6-year-old girl recovering from trauma. Victor's attention shifted from his suspended hostages to Emma with laser focus, recognizing in her the successful implementation of theories he had spent decades developing. The exile moved toward her with hands extended in welcome, his voice dropping to the coaxing tones he had once used to win over diplomatic adversaries, explaining how special she was, how her transformation proved that children could be improved beyond mere humanity into something stronger and more worthy. Emma backed away from his approach with instinctive wariness, her enhanced hearing detecting subtleties in his voice that marked him as the source of her nightmares, the monster who had broken her arm and filled her dreams with visions of violence that no child should ever have to endure. The distraction Emma provided allowed Alaric to move closer to the altar, each step calculated to avoid the explosive triggers while maintaining position between Victor and the exits that might allow escape. The Vampire King's tactical mind processed dozens of variables simultaneously, weighing the structural integrity of the building against the need to neutralize threats, considering the psychological state of the children against the political ramifications of whatever solution he chose. Victor seemed to recognize his uncle's approach for what it was, abandoning his attempts to coax Emma into cooperation in favor of more direct threats that made the suspended brothers whimper with renewed terror. The exile's hand closed around one boy's throat with crushing pressure that demonstrated exactly how much damage he could inflict before Alaric could cross the remaining distance, his other hand producing a blade that gleamed with supernatural sharpness in the cathedral's dim light. The standoff stretched between them like a taut wire, uncle and nephew locked in a confrontation that had been building for 50 years, their personal hatred overlaying political philosophies that would determine the future relationship between vampires and humans. Emma crept closer to the altar during their tense exchange, her small size and supernatural grace allowing her to approach the mechanism that controlled the chains holding the brothers without attracting Victor's immediate attention. The partial transformation that coursed through her system provided enhanced strength and speed, but also brought pain that she endured with the stoic determination that had impressed Alaric from their first meeting. She understood on some instinctive level that she was the key to resolving this confrontation, that her unique position between species gave her capabilities that neither full vampire nor human could match in this specific situation. Victor's obsession with completing Emma's transformation became apparent as he abandoned his hostages to pursue her with single-minded intensity, his exile madness focusing on her as the validation of everything he had worked toward during his decades away from court. The rogue vampire moved with inhuman speed, closing the distance between them in moments that stretched like hours in Alaric's enhanced perception, forcing the Vampire King to choose between intercepting Victor and maintaining the building's structural integrity. Emma's scream of pain as Victor's claws raked across her shoulder galvanized Alaric into motion despite the explosive charges, his protective instincts overriding tactical considerations as he launched himself across the cathedral's nave with force that cracked stone beneath his feet. The impact when uncle and nephew collided sent shockwaves through the ancient building, centuries-old masonry crumbling as supernatural strength met equally ancient rage in combat that belonged more to primordial legend than modern reality. Victor fought with the desperate fury of someone who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose, his exile having stripped away restraint and caution in favor of raw aggression that made him dangerous despite his weakened condition. Alaric's greater experience and tactical training were offset by his reluctance to kill family and his concern for the innocent lives that hung in the balance, forcing him to fight defensively while seeking opportunities to subdue, rather than destroy, his nephew. The battle raged among Gothic arches and flying buttresses, their supernatural strength turning ancient stone into weapons as they grappled for advantage in a contest that would determine whether vampires would continue their evolution toward peaceful coexistence or be dragged back into the predatory darkness from which they had emerged. The ancient stones of the cathedral groaned with supernatural stress as Victor's grip tightened around Emma's throat, his pale fingers leaving bruises that healed and reformed in endless cycles, while her partially transformed system fought to repair damage faster than he could inflict it. The two brothers hung motionless from their chains, their young faces frozen in terror as they watched the monster who had haunted their nightmares for 3 days prepare to complete whatever horrible process he had begun with the brave little girl who had tried to save them. Alaric crouched among the rubble of a collapsed pillar, his own injuries bleeding silver onto consecrated ground, while he calculated distances and angles with the desperate precision of someone who had spent centuries learning that every decision carried the weight of lives beyond counting. The explosive charges remained armed, their digital displays counting down moments until detonation, while Victor's finger hovered over the trigger mechanism with the casual indifference of someone who had already lost everything that mattered except the twisted satisfaction of dragging others into his personal hell. Emma's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk when she spoke, her words carrying a clarity and courage that belonged to someone far older than her 6 years, but emerged from a spirit that had been tempered by suffering into something pure and unbreakable. She offered herself to Victor completely, asking only that he release the brothers unharmed, her small hands reaching toward his face with the kind of trust that had once made him weep before exile, and madness had burned empathy from his soul like acid through precious metal. The rogue vampire stared at her with eyes that held centuries of accumulated hatred and pain. But something in her innocent bravery cracked the shell of rage that had protected him from feeling anything beyond the need for revenge against his uncle and the world that had rejected his vision of vampire supremacy. Victor's hands trembled as he looked into Emma's face and saw reflected there the child he had once been, before court politics and family expectations had twisted him into something that used innocence as a weapon and suffering as a tool for political gain. The memory of his own transformation centuries ago surfaced unbidden, the terror and confusion of a young boy thrust into immortality without consent or preparation, shaped by mentors who valued strength over compassion and dominance over understanding. He had sworn never to become the kind of monster who preyed on children, had built his early reputation on protecting human settlements from rogue vampires who saw mortals as nothing more than food sources to be exploited without consideration. But exile had stripped away the civilized veneer he had cultivated over decades of court life, leaving only the raw hunger and fury that came from being cut off from family and purpose while watching his uncle build a kingdom based on principles that Victor saw as weakness and betrayal of their essential nature. Emma's offer to sacrifice herself for strangers forced him to confront what he had become in his quest to prove that vampires were meant to rule through fear rather than hide in shadows. and the realization that he was now exactly the kind of monster he had once hunted filled him with self-loathing that made his ancient bones ache with phantom pain. Yet even as something like conscience stirred in the ruins of his honor, the partial transformation he had begun in Emma was accelerating beyond his ability to control, her human physiology beginning to collapse under the strain of supernatural changes that had never been meant to occur gradually in a child so young. Dr. Martinez's voice echoed through the cathedral as she burst through the side entrance with hospital security guards, who immediately recognized that their training had not prepared them for the supernatural horror unfolding in the ancient nave. Her medical bag clutched tight in hands that shook with adrenaline and determination. She took in Emma's deteriorating condition with the rapid assessment skills that had saved lives in emergency rooms for 15 years. The partial vampire transformation was entering a critical phase. Emma's enhanced healing factor beginning to consume her body's resources faster than her human metabolism could supply them, creating a cascade effect that would lead to multiple organ failure within hours unless the process was either completed or somehow reversed through methods that existed far beyond conventional medicine. Dr. Martinez found herself shouting medical observations that sounded like incantations in the cathedral's acoustics, describing cellular breakdown and neurological stress patterns, while Alaric and Victor faced each other across centuries of family betrayal and philosophical difference. The human doctor's presence added another layer of complexity to the standoff, her vulnerability to supernatural violence making her a potential hostage, while her medical expertise made her the only hope for saving Emma's life, regardless of whatever resolution emerged from the confrontation between uncle and nephew. She positioned herself between Emma and Victor with the same protective instincts that had driven her to become a physician, wielding stethoscope and medical knowledge like weapons against an enemy that could kill her without effort, but might hesitate to harm someone whose skills were necessary for Emma's survival. The cathedral itself seemed to respond to the crisis unfolding within its sacred walls, ancient stones beginning to glow with ethereal light that had not manifested since the earliest days of vampire civilization, when their kind had first established laws to govern supernatural conduct. Alaric felt the building's dormant magic stirring around him like awakening from centuries of slumber, power that predated his own immortality, pulsing through Gothic arches and flying buttresses in patterns that spoke of possibilities he had thought lost to history. The sanctuary protocol was more legend than documented fact, a theoretical binding that vampire scholars had debated for millennia without ever witnessing its implementation, requiring conditions so specific and costs so terrible that no king had ever been desperate enough to attempt its invocation. Yet as Emma's life hung in the balance, and Victor's madness threatened to destroy everything Alaric had built over 8 centuries of careful progress, the ancient magic began to recognize the presence of a vampire ruler willing to sacrifice everything for the protection of innocence, regardless of species. The protocol demanded absolute commitment to justice over personal survival, requiring a king to bind a rogue's power at the cost of his own immortality, stripping away supernatural abilities and leaving behind only mortal humanity, in exchange for the permanent neutralization of a threat that could not be stopped through conventional means. Alaric had studied the theoretical framework during his early years as king, dismissing it as philosophical exercise rather than practical governance, but now he felt the cathedral's stones responding to his growing resolve with power that made his ancient blood sing with recognition and terror. Victor sensed the shift in magical energy before anyone else, his exile having sharpened his supernatural senses through years of survival in hostile territory, where the slightest warning could mean the difference between feeding and becoming prey for older, stronger vampires who saw rogues as competition to be eliminated. The cathedral's awakening filled him with panic that cut through madness and rage to reach the strategic mind that had once made him heir apparent to the most powerful vampire throne in existence. He understood instinctively that his uncle was preparing to invoke something far beyond normal vampire magic, power that belonged to the earliest days of their species, when the line between supernatural ability and divine intervention had been thinner than gossamer in moonlight. His grip on Emma tightened as he tried to accelerate her transformation through brute force rather than the careful process he had originally planned, pouring his own supernatural essence into her small body, with reckless abandon that risked killing them both in his desperation to complete his work before Alaric could sacrifice himself to stop it. The rogue vampire's centuries of accumulated power flowed into Emma like molten silver through crystal, her partially transformed system struggling to contain energies that would have destroyed a normal human instantly while threatening to burn out the careful balance between species that made her survival possible. Dr. Martinez watched Emma's vital signs spike beyond anything compatible with life as Victor's forced transformation sent supernatural energy cascading through systems that had never been designed to channel such power. Her medical training warring with the supernatural reality that made normal treatment protocols useless against conditions that existed outside the boundaries of known science. Elias materialized in the cathedral's entrance with the sudden appearance that marked emergency teleportation, his ancient features grave with knowledge that he had torn from forbidden texts and sealed archives in his race to find solutions for an impossible situation. The court mage carried scrolls that predated written history, their surfaces covered with symbols that hurt mortal eyes to contemplate directly, containing research about the sanctuary protocol that confirmed Alaric's growing understanding of what the ancient magic required from those who dared invoke it. The binding would strip away 8 centuries of accumulated power, reduce a vampire king to mortal humanity, and leave him vulnerable to aging and death in exchange for permanently neutralizing a rogue whose threat extended beyond immediate violence to encompass the destruction of everything their species had achieved through millennia of careful evolution. Elias shouted the ritual's requirements over the growing supernatural storm that filled the cathedral with energies older than civilization, his voice barely audible above the harmonics created by divine sanctuary magic clashing with vampire power in combinations that had not occurred since the earliest days of supernatural law. The protocol demanded willing sacrifice from a ruler acting purely for the protection of innocence, requiring absolute commitment to justice even at the cost of personal annihilation, conditions that Alaric met as he began channeling his life force into ancient stones that had witnessed the birth of vampire civilization and now prepared to witness its transformation. The golden light that erupted from the cathedral's stones grew brighter than sunrise as Alaric poured centuries of accumulated power into the sanctuary protocol, his immortal essence flowing through Gothic architecture, like blood through ancient arteries, while the building itself became a conduit for magic that transcended the boundaries between species and touched something approaching divine intervention. Victor's scream of rage and terror echoed through the nave as he felt the binding energies beginning to wrap around him like chains forged from solidified time, his supernatural abilities slowly draining away as the protocol stripped power from both king and rogue in the ultimate expression of justice through sacrifice. Emma collapsed as the forced transformation energy was suddenly cut off, her small body no longer able to contain the supernatural forces that Victor had been pouring into her, while Dr. Martinez rushed to her side with medical equipment that seemed pitifully inadequate against conditions that existed at the intersection of magic and medicine. The cathedral filled with harmonics that belonged more to angelic choirs than earthly architecture, as vampire magic clashed with sanctuary power in a conflict that would determine whether ancient laws could still function in a modern world where the boundaries between species had become increasingly blurred. Alaric felt his immortality burning away like fog before the dawn, 8 centuries of supernatural strength and speed and senses fading into mortality, while his nephew's form began to petrify into stone that would preserve his body, while binding his power for eternity. The sacrifice was working, but the cost was proving even higher than the ancient texts had warned, taking not only Alaric's vampiric nature, but threatening to claim his life entirely as the protocol demanded payment in proportion to the threat being neutralized and the power required to bind someone as ancient and dangerous as Victor Dracul. The cathedral doors burst open as dawn's first light touched the horizon, admitting a procession of figures whose supernatural grace and ancient authority marked them as members of Alaric's inner court, arriving too late to prevent the crisis, but in time to witness its devastating resolution. Lady Vivian led them through the rubble-strewn nave, her elegant features etched with grief, as she took in the scene that would reshape vampire civilization forever. Their king kneeling beside a dying child, while his own immortality burned away like morning mist, his nephew transformed into a statue of black stone that would serve as eternal monument to the price of choosing vengeance over wisdom. Marcus and the other court members moved with military precision to secure the area, checking on the rescued brothers who clung to each other in traumatized silence, while medical personnel summoned by Dr. Martinez began the delicate process of treating injuries that existed at the intersection of supernatural violence and human fragility. The vampire court had arrived expecting to find their king triumphant over a rogue who threatened everything they had built. Instead, discovering that victory had come at a cost that left them leaderless at the moment when leadership was most desperately needed. Lady Vivian knelt beside Alaric as his strength continued to ebb, her centuries of political experience allowing her to assess the situation with ruthless clarity, even as personal grief threatened to overwhelm her composure. The sanctuary protocol was irreversible once invoked, its ancient magic already too deeply woven into the cathedral's stones to be undone by any power known to vampire kind, meaning that the strongest and wisest ruler their species had known in millennia was becoming mortal with each passing moment, while responsibilities that had defined his existence for 8 centuries passed to shoulders that had never borne such weight. She accepted the transition with the grace that had made her his most trusted advisor, issuing quiet orders that began the process of managing a crisis that extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of Victor's defeat. Elias worked with desperate intensity over Emma's unconscious form, his ancient hands weaving patterns of magic that drew upon the cathedral's residual sanctuary energy, while Dr. Martinez provided medical support that bridged the gap between supernatural healing and human science. The court mage had never attempted to reverse a partial transformation, the theoretical framework existing only in texts so old that their authors had been dust for millennia. But Emma's unique condition offered possibilities that normal vampire conversion did not. The sanctuary magic that had bound Victor and stripped Alaric's immortality continued to resonate through the cathedral's stones, creating currents of divine energy that could potentially purge supernatural influence from her human system if channeled with sufficient skill and precision. Dr. Martinez found herself calling out medical observations that helped Elias understand how Emma's organs were responding to his magical intervention, her scientific training providing crucial data about cellular regeneration rates and neurological activity that allowed the mage to adjust his techniques in real time. The collaboration between human medicine and vampire magic created something unprecedented, a treatment protocol that existed at the intersection of species and challenged the traditional boundaries that had kept their worlds separate for centuries. Emma's vital signs fluctuated wildly as sanctuary energy flowed through her small body, burning away the vampire essence that Victor had forced into her system, while carefully preserving the human biology that made her who she was beneath the supernatural modifications. The process was agonizing to watch, her young face contorting with pain as divine magic and vampire power clashed within her bloodstream. But Dr. Martinez's steady hands and medical expertise provided the anchor of human knowledge that kept the healing from destroying what it sought to save. The rescued brothers huddled together near the cathedral's altar, their trauma evident in every trembling movement as vampire court members worked to heal their physical injuries while preparing the memory modifications that would protect them from psychological damage too severe for young minds to process. The children had witnessed horrors that would have broken adult sanity, their innocent understanding of the world shattered by 3 days of captivity under a monster who had used their suffering as both weapon and entertainment in his campaign against everything decent in vampire society. Yet their resilience shone through the terror, their protective instincts toward each other and concern for Emma, demonstrating the kind of courage that reminded every vampire present why their king had chosen to sacrifice his immortality rather than allow such innocence to be corrupted or destroyed. The memory modifications were performed with exquisite care, replacing traumatic recollections with false but harmless memories of a gas leak that had required emergency evacuation, explaining their injuries and hospitalization without burdening them with supernatural knowledge that would poison the rest of their lives. The vampire court's specialists worked with techniques refined over centuries of protecting human civilization from awareness of predators who walked among them, but never before had the modifications been applied with such gentle precision or genuine concern for the subject's well-being. Each child would remember being heroes who helped each other during a scary situation, their courage acknowledged and celebrated rather than erased, their bond as brothers strengthened rather than tainted by shared trauma that could have destroyed their trust in the world around them. Alaric's transformation accelerated as the sun climbed higher, his vampire nature dissolving like shadows before dawn, while mortal sensations flooded through a nervous system that had not experienced purely human perception for 8 centuries. The warmth of sunlight streaming through broken, stained glass felt like benediction against skin that had known only moonlight and artificial illumination for longer than most civilizations had existed, while the simple act of breathing carried scents and flavors that his supernatural senses had filtered into mere data rather than experiential pleasure. Dr. Martinez monitored his vital signs with the same care she devoted to Emma, noting the gradual changes as his enhanced healing faded and left him vulnerable to injury and aging that would eventually claim the life he had preserved through supernatural power for so long. The former vampire king found himself overwhelmed by sensory input that his mortal brain had to process without the enhanced cognitive abilities that had allowed him to analyze thousands of data points simultaneously, forcing him to focus on single experiences with an intensity that made simple things like Emma's breathing or the sound of rain on ancient stones seem profound beyond description. Lady Vivian stayed close as he adapted to mortality, her presence providing stability during a transition that challenged everything he had believed about identity and purpose, while court members began the delicate process of implementing succession protocols that had been theoretical since no vampire king had willingly abdicated power in recorded history. The political implications of his sacrifice would reshape vampire society for generations, establishing precedents for leadership accountability and the limits of acceptable behavior that went far beyond anything written in their ancient laws. Emma's recovery began as afternoon light filled the cathedral with warmth that seemed to accelerate the sanctuary magic flowing through her small body, the divine energy finally overwhelming the last traces of Victor's forced transformation and restoring her to purely human physiology. Dr. Martinez watched her patient's vital signs stabilize with the professional satisfaction that came from successful treatment of a condition that had existed beyond the boundaries of medical science, while Elias collapsed from exhaustion after hours of channeling magic that had pushed his ancient abilities to their absolute limits. The little girl's eyes opened as consciousness returned, her gaze immediately seeking Alaric's face with the trust and affection that had sustained them both through the darkest moments of their ordeal together. She was fully human again, her enhanced senses and supernatural strength gone, as if they had never existed. But the courage and wisdom that had impressed the vampire court remained unchanged by her return to mortality. Emma sat up slowly, testing her restored limitations with the same practical approach she had shown throughout her involvement in events that had reshaped the supernatural world around her, then reached for Alaric's hand with the natural affection of a child who had found in him the kind of protector she had needed during her greatest crisis. Her laughter rang through the cathedral like music as she realized that the scary vampire was gone forever, turned to stone where he could never hurt anyone again, while the nice vampire king had become a nice human king who could sit in the sunshine and share cookies and maybe teach her to read the big books in his library. The sound of her joy brought tears to eyes that had not wept in centuries, the purely human response to overwhelming relief and love, proving to Alaric that some things gained in mortality more than compensated for the supernatural powers he had lost. Dr. Martinez found herself permanently drawn into a world she had never imagined, her medical expertise making her invaluable as the official liaison between vampire court and human medical community, while her personal investment in Emma's well-being ensured her continued involvement in affairs that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between species. Lady Vivian proved remarkably capable as interim ruler, implementing Alaric's modernization plans with political skill that maintained stability while introducing progressive policies that protected both vampires and humans from the kind of extremism that Victor had represented. The vampire court established new protocols for handling rogue vampires that required human consultation for any cases involving children, recognizing that Alaric's sacrifice had demonstrated the importance of protecting innocence, regardless of species, while acknowledging that purely supernatural justice was insufficient for addressing crimes that crossed the boundaries between their worlds. Emma became an unofficial ambassador between vampire and human society, her fearless curiosity and genuine affection for both species helping bridge centuries of mistrust, while her unique experience provided insights that formal diplomacy could never achieve. She spent her days learning about vampire history and human science with equal enthusiasm, asking questions that forced ancient creatures to examine assumptions they had never questioned, while helping mortal doctors understand supernatural physiology in ways that advanced both magical and medical knowledge. The cathedral was restored as a monument to the sacrifice that had saved two species from war, its stones forever resonating with sanctuary magic that reminded all who entered of the price of peace and the courage required to choose protection over power when the stakes included the innocent lives that gave meaning to civilization itself. The elementary school playground buzzed with the familiar chaos of recess as Emma Chen swung from the monkey bars with practiced ease, her small hands gripping the metal rungs, while autumn wind tangled her dark hair across laughing features that showed no trace of the supernatural ordeal that had changed her life 6 months earlier. The purple cast that had adorned her arm for weeks was gone, replaced by a thin silver scar that caught sunlight like a badge of courage only she understood, while her classmates remained blissfully unaware that their friend had once stood at the center of a conflict that could have shattered the careful balance between two species. Emma had returned to second grade with stories that sounded like elaborate fantasy to teachers who praised her creativity while missing the underlying truth that made her compositions about vampire kings and magical cathedrals read like documentary rather than imagination. She navigated playground politics with newfound wisdom that sometimes startled adults, her experience with genuine monsters making schoolyard bullies seem less threatening than amusing, while her inexplicable ability to sense dishonesty turned her into an unofficial mediator for disputes that might have escalated without her intervention. The children accepted her insights with the casual adaptability that marked their age group, incorporating her unusual perceptiveness into their games and conflicts as naturally as they adjusted to growth spurts and changing interests, never questioning why Emma always knew when someone was lying or why she sometimes stared at shadows with the intensity of someone expecting familiar figures to emerge from darkness. Her teachers noted improved academic performance and social skills that seemed advanced beyond her years, attributing the changes to maturity gained through her hospitalization, rather than recognizing the deeper transformation that came from surviving encounters with forces that existed beyond human understanding. Alaric discovered that mortality brought pleasures he had forgotten during 8 centuries of supernatural existence. Simple joys like tending the garden he had planted around the restored cathedral, where morning sunlight warmed soil that his Vampire nature would never have allowed him to touch. The aging that marked his return to human limitations showed in silver threading through dark hair and fine lines around eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. But his face carried peace that had been absent during the weight of immortal responsibility for protecting species from each other. He spent his days serving as advisor to Lady Vivienne's administration, his centuries of experience proving invaluable in navigating political complexities that arose from implementing progressive policies while maintaining security protocols that kept both vampires and humans safe from exposure or exploitation. The former vampire king found unexpected satisfaction in manual labor, his hands learning again the texture of earth and growing things, while his enhanced senses faded to purely human perception that made individual experiences more intense, even as his awareness of broader patterns diminished to mortal scope. Dr. Martinez visited regularly, their friendship developing from shared trauma into genuine affection based on mutual respect and commitment to protecting the communities they served. Her medical expertise complementing his supernatural knowledge as they worked to establish protocols for treating conditions that existed at the intersection of species. Their conversations ranged from practical matters of vampire physiology to philosophical questions about the nature of humanity and immortality. Explorations of identity and purpose that gained depth from their unique perspectives on transformation and sacrifice. The cathedral had become something unprecedented in vampire history, a memorial to sacrifice that served simultaneously as research center for supernatural and human cooperation, while housing Victor's stone prison in a chamber where scholars from both species could study the results of ancient magic applied to modern problems. Emma visited twice weekly, bringing flowers for the garden and chattering about school activities, while Alaric tended roses and jasmine that bloomed in patterns that seemed to respond to the sanctuary magic still resonating through consecrated stones. She showed no fear of Victor's petrified form, treating the stone statue with the same matter-of-fact acceptance she applied to all aspects of her expanded understanding of the world, occasionally leaving drawings or small gifts that demonstrated her belief in redemption, even for monsters who had chosen darkness over light. The research conducted within the cathedral's walls advanced both magical theory and medical science, as vampire scholars worked alongside human doctors to develop treatments for conditions that had previously been considered impossible to address through conventional means. Dr. Martinez led a team that included Elias and several other court mages, their collaboration producing papers and protocols that would reshape supernatural medicine for generations while maintaining the secrecy necessary to protect both communities from exposure that could trigger panic or exploitation. The memorial aspect of the cathedral drew visitors from vampire courts across the globe, ancient creatures who came to witness the site where a king had chosen mortality over power and discovered that sacrifice could accomplish what force never could. Emma's 7th birthday arrived with autumn colors, painting the world in shades that reminded everyone of change and transformation, her party planned as carefully as any diplomatic summit to accommodate guests whose dietary requirements and sunlight sensitivity created challenges that most parents never faced. The celebration took place in the cathedral's garden, where afternoon shadows provided comfort for vampire courtiers who attended in human disguise, while Emma's school friends enjoyed cake and games that seemed perfectly normal, despite the supernatural security watching from concealed positions throughout the area. Lady Vivian arrived with a formal delegation that included Marcus and other court members who had become genuinely fond of the little girl, whose courage had reshaped their understanding of what strength meant in a world where different species had to coexist. Their expensive gifts carefully chosen to appear appropriate for a human child, while carrying deeper significance that only Emma and her supernatural family understood. Alaric watched the festivities with the contentment of someone who had found unexpected joy in ordinary moments, his mortal senses savoring details like Emma's laughter and the taste of birthday cake that his vampire nature had never allowed him to appreciate, while Dr. Martinez fielded questions from curious parents about the dietary restrictions and sun sensitivity that marked some of their more unusual guests. The party games included treasure hunts and relay races that let vampire courtiers demonstrate careful restraint while ensuring Emma's human friends felt included and valued, creating an atmosphere of celebration that bridged species differences through shared affection for a remarkable child who had taught ancient creatures new lessons about courage and compassion. The official ceremony occurred as sunset painted the sky in colors that allowed vampire guests to move more freely, Lady Vivienne presenting Emma with an ornate scroll that proclaimed her the first human ambassador in vampire history, while explaining that the title carried both honor and responsibility for helping their peoples understand each other better. Emma accepted the appointment with the same practical enthusiasm she brought to all challenges, immediately asking detailed questions about her duties and the resources available for accomplishing goals that seemed impossibly ambitious, until her questioners remembered that this was the same child who had offered her life to save strangers and succeeded in melting the heart of a monster who had thought himself beyond redemption. The vampire courtiers who had initially viewed her involvement as dangerous liability found themselves genuinely moved by her acceptance speech, delivered with childhood directness that cut through centuries of diplomatic protocol to reach truths about friendship and trust that formal negotiations could never achieve. Her wish, whispered to Alaric as she blew out 7 candles shaped like roses, was that all the scared monsters in the world would find someone brave enough to be their friend. A sentiment that brought tears to eyes that had witnessed too much darkness and not enough hope during long centuries of protecting secrets and maintaining balances that sometimes felt more like prisons than preservation. The celebration continued into evening as vampire and human guests mingled with increasing comfort, their shared investment in Emma's well-being, creating bonds that transcended species differences, while establishing precedents for cooperation that would influence supernatural diplomacy for generations. Elias approached Alaric as the party wound down, his ancient features carrying news that would reshape supernatural society even more dramatically than Emma's individual impact had already accomplished. Reports from vampire courts worldwide indicated requests for similar human liaisons, younger generation vampires inspired by Emma's example to seek bridges between species that their elders had kept carefully separate for millennia of cautious coexistence. The court mage explained that Emma's courage had catalyzed a fundamental shift in vampire thinking about humanity, moving beyond protection and concealment toward genuine partnership and mutual benefit that acknowledged human wisdom and strength rather than treating mortal limitations as weaknesses to be managed or ignored. Other courts were establishing research centers modeled on their cathedral memorial, creating spaces where vampire and human knowledge could merge to address challenges that neither species could solve alone, while diplomatic protocols were being rewritten to include human consultation on matters that had previously been considered purely supernatural concerns. The transformation extended beyond policy into personal relationships, as vampires who had spent centuries avoiding meaningful contact with humans began seeking friendships and partnerships that enriched both species while challenging assumptions that had governed supernatural behavior since their earliest recorded history. Emma's impact was expanding exponentially, her simple example of courage and compassion creating ripple effects that reached across continents and cultures, to touch vampire communities that had never imagined cooperation possible or beneficial for anyone involved in bridging the gap between mortal and immortal perspectives on existence and purpose. The final image that would remain in Alaric's memory was Emma's cast signature, carefully preserved and framed in his study as a reminder of the moment when everything changed, purple marker spelling out his name in the careful handwriting of a child who had seen him not as an immortal king, but as someone who needed a friend during his darkest hour. The simple autograph represented everything he had gained through his sacrifice, proof that choosing powerlessness over power had led to connections and experiences that no amount of supernatural strength could have provided, while serving as daily reminder that true leadership sometimes required losing everything to save what mattered most. Dr. Martinez had helped him select the frame, their shared understanding of Emma's significance creating a bond that transcended the circumstances of their meeting, while establishing a friendship that enriched both their lives through perspectives that neither could have achieved alone. The study itself had become a symbol of transformation, its shelves holding both ancient vampire texts and modern medical journals, while sunrise streamed through windows that a vampire king could never have opened, creating a space where past and future merged through present choices that honored both heritage and progress. Emma visited regularly to read from his collection and share stories about school activities that connected his mortal existence to the ongoing miracle of childhood resilience and growth, her presence providing anchor to a humanity he had rediscovered through sacrifice, while her questions challenged him to articulate wisdom, gained through centuries of experience in terms that a 7-year-old could understand and apply. The purple marker signature remained vivid against white paper, its simple message carrying weight that formal diplomatic documents could never match. Proof that sometimes the most profound transformations began with small gestures of friendship offered across boundaries that seemed impossible to bridge, until someone brave enough to try discovered that courage and compassion could accomplish what force and fear never could.